Hello, everybody. Here we are. Today, we are going to talk about the United States budget and the United States national debt. Let's get into this, shall we? First thing to know is we need to talk about what a budget is. So, a budget is a plan. It's basically a prediction about how you're going to first of all earn money, and then when you're going to go out and then spend that money, it's a plan for how you're going to go spend that money. So, individuals like you and me, we keep budgets to make sure that we're being wise with our money and being able to pay our bills and avoid overspending or running into problems. And the government also keeps a budget. It's a very big deal. The president and Congress create it every single year. And again, just like anyone's budget, it's a plan for how they're going to spend the money that they earn through taxes. The plan is for an entire year at a time. Okay. So a personal budget like you and I might keep might be just for like a month at a time. But the US government looks at the whole plan for the whole year, and that's how they make their budget. When you create a budget, a plan, you get one of two outcomes. Okay. The first outcome is, well, not the outcome you usually want. It's what happens when you don't earn enough money to cover all your expenses. It means that something happened and you had to spend more than you earned. We have a name for this. We call this a budget deficit. And so when the government's expenses are more than its tax revenues, meaning it's more than the money that it's earning in a single year, then that means they have a deficit for that year. And so to cover those extra expenses, if they don't have the money and they have to pay for something, they issue bonds, savings bonds. They give bonds to people, they give bonds to banks, and then people give them cash, and then they use this cash to then pay for these extra expenses. The problem, though, is that these deficits will eventually turn into a debt that they will have to repay those bonds. But it's not the same thing. A deficit and a debt are not exactly the same thing. We'll define the difference in a little bit. The other way a budget plan can go is the good way. It's a surplus. A surplus is what happens when you actually have more money than you need. So, from our government's point of view, it would be like saying their expenses were less than their revenues or the money they earned for a year. So, it would be like if you had a job and you knew that every single week you had to spend $200 to pay for gas, to pay your cell phone bill, whatever, put food on the table, but every single week you get paid $250. Your pay, 250, is more than your expenses, 200. So every single week you would have a $50 surplus. And that's awesome because it means you can use this extra money every single week and you can save it, you can put it towards long-term goals. That's the way you want to be able to have a budget work out. So for our government, what we see, there's a little chart. This chart, I really like it. It shows the deficits, which are each of these red lines going down, and the surpluses since basically 1970. And now, obviously, I'm covering up 2002 on, but long story short, as you can see that from 1970 up until about 1998, 97, 98, we did indeed have deficits. That means that every single year the government had to spend more money than it earned. However, after 1997, we start to have surpluses. And we're going to talk about why that is. I'll go ahead and tell you this happens because of a few different things. First of all, um, let me go in here. Yeah, why did it shrink? For one reason, we were no longer in the Cold War with the Soviet Union. We had to spend a lot of money to make sure we had enough nuclear weapons to blow them off the planet. And then when that ended, we realized we can save a lot of money because we don't make so many nuclear weapons. That was good. And at the same time, around those same years, the 1990s, we have the birth of modern computer technology and the internet became a thing. It's kind of crazy. And so the internet allowed for businesses to make money in new ways, and new businesses came to be like Amazon and eBay and Google. And these big businesses helped generate more money for the national government. They collected more money through taxes, and it meant that they could start to have smaller and smaller and smaller deficits, and eventually they began to have surpluses. So now what we need to do is we need to talk about the national debt. Again, a deficit and a debt are related, but they're not the same thing, and people often use these terms the wrong way. A debt, here's your definition, it's the sum total of what the government owes its lenders over all time. So what we mean by that is that every single year that you had to borrow money from somebody to help pay your budget expenses, meaning you had a deficit, the amount of money you borrowed to cover your deficit, you have to pay back. And so that gets added into your debt. And whatever debt you already had before that, it's still there until you've paid it off. And so each new debt, each new deficit, see, I just used the wrong term, each new deficit gets added to the existing debt, and it grows and grows and grows. So looking back at the chart, we see that in the 1970s and 1980s, the deficits were pretty small, only a cool $300 billion or so. But then in the mid 1980s and 1990s, we see that these numbers get much larger. And so during those years, if we were to compare that to our national debt, which I've just pulled up here, in the 1970s, you see the debt didn't grow very much. It went up, obviously, but not very much because each deficit was relatively small. But then in the 80s and early 90s, we see the debt really start to accelerate. It gets larger because we're adding these much bigger deficits to every single year, right? The debt is getting added to and added to and added to with much larger amounts. You'll notice though, however, in the 1990s on into the early 2000s, like we said, because we are reducing our deficits and getting into surpluses, we see the debt starts to kind of slow down a little bit, kind of starts to plateau right around here. And what was great was that here in the year 2000, everybody expected things to continue to get better and better and better. This chart here in the bottom corner is actually an old scan that I took from our old economics textbook from 2008. In that textbook, which had been printed in the year 2000, they had a chart in which they estimated that the US government surplus would continue to grow for the foreseeable future, meaning everybody thought that the budget was going to keep getting better and better and better. Do we think that happened? No, of course not, because that would be too good of news, right? We always have to have bad news, it seems like, when it comes to our government and its money. And so something happened, and it happened right there. This is when the government, I'm sorry, when that textbook was printed, but then something happened right there. And it derailed what we anticipated was going to be progress, progress, progress. It didn't happen. And if we were in class, I would ask you, what happened here? I'll go ahead and tell you what happened here. This is the year 2001. I was a sophomore in high school, and on September 11th, 2001, the United States was attacked by terrorists, and that led to our country going to war. That was not in our plan. Some people say it was, the conspiracy theorists do. I don't believe that's true. But going to war is very expensive, and that was not in our budget. And so because we had these incredibly large war expenses, it meant that our surpluses eventually turned into deficits. And so we had deficits from the years 2002 on into 2004, 5, and 6. And it looked like, you'll notice that things were improving, which is great. These years we have reductions in our deficits. We looked like we were going to be heading into surplus territory, just like we had done in the early 2000s. But then something, oh, the helicopters, oh, there's a tank, we're at war. But then something happened right here. This is the year 2008. You might remember that in the year 2008, we entered into what we call the 2008 financial meltdown, which kicked off the Great Recession. And so this was not in our plan either. One of the things that the government did then was they spent $700 billion to try to stimulate the economy. Very similar to the stimulus that was done just recently with the COVID-19 stuff, although that was almost 3 times as much. But back then, $700 billion had to be spent, and that was not in our budget. That was not in the plan. So guess what you see this do to our deficits? Watch this. Well, bam! Look at these. These are insane. The deficits that we had from 2009 on were astronomical. They were much larger than ever before. $1.48 trillion in 2009, 1.34 in 2010, and so on. And so these incredibly large deficits got added in to our large national debt, so that in those years the national debt grew and grew and grew. And when this chart was put out, boom, in 2012, it was as high as $16 trillion. Now that was 2012. That's 8 plus years ago. And if you're watching this video in the future, I'm making this in 2020. If I use this again in the future, obviously, you imagine how many years that is from now. We can see what the US debt is now. We open this website, we can go ahead and see there's a lot of numbers on this web page. I'm going to zoom in because this is the number we're looking at right now. The current United States national debt is $24 trillion. And so this is the result of the revenue we're earning this year, which is 3.4 trillion, and the spending we're doing, which is 5.7 trillion, is creating a deficit of, let's see, where is it? It's creating a deficit of $2.8 trillion. This deficit, I'm sorry, right here, $2.2 trillion. This deficit is getting added into our debt, which is why this number is increasing. It's quite a substantial sum of money. So people sometimes worry about if this is going to be sustainable or not. We talk about how if we were a family borrowing money and having such a huge amount of debt, banks and other people would look at us and say, we're never going to lend you money again. But the thing is that the United States government, it's different than a family. They have different ways of generating income, and truth be told, they're very, very wealthy. So we'll talk later about, is this good news or bad news? Suffice to say, it is substantial news, and it's something that we can discuss later on. So let's recap. We know that our government's budget had been doing fairly well in the 1990s and early 2000s, but in September 11, 2001, these attacks and then the unplanned wars that we went to in Afghanistan and Iraq, they caused those surpluses to turn into some serious, but at the time, manageable deficits. But then, just a few years after that, the meltdown led to very huge unplanned stimulus plans, which created giant deficits. And these huge deficits were added to the debt. And even now, with COVID-19 and the stimulus we have from that, those deficits will also be added into our debt, which will make it grow even faster. And so many people are starting to worry that this debt could be too large to even consider repaying. We're going to stop there. Okay. Thank you for watching, and keep in touch.